Thank you, Lori. We're so pleased to have so many of you join us for our second Witness and Grace program. Today, we're focusing on the unique legacy and lessons of the Sisters of Selma. And we're honored to have three very special guests on our program today. Carol Colburn is a professor emerita of religious studies, director of the CSJ Heritage Center at Avila University in Kansas City. She is also a consultant for the Buchanan Initiative for Peace and Nonviolence at Avila University. She's published and presented extensively on the topic of American Catholic sisters. She was a historian consultant for the 2007 PBS film Sisters of Selma, Bearing Witness for Change. Recently, she authored a 9-part Q&A series on the Sisters of Selma for Global Sisters Report. Sister Patricia McCann is a Sister of Mercy in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She has extensive experience in religious community administration, teaching, and educational administration, and retreat and workshop presentations. Currently, she spends time writing with a focus on church and social justice issues. She serves as the sacristan at the Convent of Mercy Chapel. Therese Stawowy is a retired teacher, an administrator, psychologist, former Sister of Loretto, a longtime Loretto community co-member, hospice volunteer, and advisory board member at Dominican University for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. She is still and will always be a social activist in mind and spirit. Now we will turn to Patricia, Sister Patricia, for our opening prayer. So Carol, will you just start us off, please, and give us some background context before the March to Selma?
Okay, thank you. I think it's very helpful just to look back a little bit in time to see the context, to understand what the sisters were going to and what they faced. I'm going to go back 11 years initially, 1954, when Brown versus the Board of Education was struck down, the separate but equal law, and integrated schools. This law had been withheld for 58 years prior to that. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give her seat to a white man, and the Montgomery bus boycott, which ran over a year, was begun. It's also the debut of Martin Luther King Jr. as a leader in the movement. In 1957, Little Rock High School was integrated, but only with the help of the National Guard. In the 1960s, particularly around 1960s, sit-ins began, particularly in white public accommodations, lunch counters, movie theaters, and that was a strategy used to try to integrate other public facilities beyond public schools. 1961, freedom rides began throughout the South. It was across interstate bus routes. The idea was a lot of people, you have to remember, were traveling by bus then, and the freedom riders would get off, try to integrate everything from the restrooms to the lobbies to the lunch counters. And there was a tremendous amount of violence, particularly in Alabama during this time period. And John Lewis almost lost his life there. In 1963, we have the March on Washington, the Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream speech. Later, unfortunately, only 3 weeks later, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was bombed, and 4 young girls were killed as they were changing into their choir robes for church. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed and signed by President Johnson, banning discrimination by race, color, sex, religion, and national origin. 1964, that summer, which was the summer before the 1964 elections, it was called Freedom Summer. A lot of particularly college students and young people fanned out across Mississippi to try to get Black citizens registered to vote in the upcoming elections. And that's also a time when Cheney, Goodman, and Schwimmer, three young men down there for Freedom Summer were killed and lost their lives. That puts us up to 1965. In February, a very singular event happened just outside of Selma. A young man by the name of Jimmy Lee Jackson was in a demonstration that was peaceful. It was at night, and he ended up being brutally beaten and shot by police. He died at a hospital that the Sisters of St. Joseph ran in Selma, and this is in Sister Barbara Lum's story. She has referred to him sort of the George Floyd of 1965 because his death then began the planning for the march in Selma as the place for voting rights to be challenged took place. Dallas County was the county for Selma. And although the majority of the population were Black, only 2% of the population of the Black citizens were registered to vote. So that set up March 7th, Bloody Sunday, the interaction that began these Selma marches and eventually culminated in March of the 25th of March from the Selma to Montgomery. So that just sort of puts you up to date, gets you caught up, and I'll let the sisters talk about their experiences from here.
I knew 7 o'clock the next morning, there were 2 rickety old planes that were taking 57 of us, 6 nuns. The rest were priests from St. Louis. I don't think they made too much room for us, but we did get on those planes. We did get to Selma. We were scared. It was quiet and pensive on the planes. When we got there, we met Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young at the AME church. And we then were in the church and we looked out from our windows at the church and could see the people living in Selma who smiled at us. And you could tell they were so grateful we were there. We were grateful to be there. And yes, nose to nose with the people, the sheriff and his guards. We stood there in Selma, and thanks to Joyce Hart, who is here, she made the Sisters of Selma movie. I am grateful to her, to the sisters for letting me go and set my soul at peace.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing both the external and the internal journey as well. But I want to know, Sister Patricia, and just how did your experience in that time influence your ministries later? Sister Patricia, let's start with you. What did it do?
Well, it was a life-changing experience. I had never experienced violence of the kind we experienced there. And I think for 4 days, I felt like I was going to throw up nonstop because it was so frightening. The pictures that you've seen in movies of the actual march, the police and deputized police on horseback beating the people in the march, I was in all of that. And I had never seen or even imagined anything like it. My dad was a policeman. I thought policemen were nice people, you know. I was terrified. And I was especially worried. I couldn't, you know, this was a day before cell phones, and I couldn't find any of the students that I had taken with me. We had been scattered by these deputized marshals who were on horseback and who had bullwhips in their hands and who were beating and chasing the kids, you know. So we gathered there and we were literally, as Theresa just described, we were literally in terror for 4 days. Many of the Black families took us in, kept us on their porches, and really sheltered us so that we could have some kind of safety from these men. But anyhow, it was a life-changing event. I was a teacher of history, American history mainly. From that point on, I made sure that my teaching always included social justice content so that we could address the social teaching of the church, we could talk about racism, we could discuss some of the problems. When I first came home from the march, I had nightmares for days. Fortunately, that did not last forever. But the reality of what the experience was did stay with me forever.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister Patricia. Therese, what about you? What did that experience do to influence your ministries?
I think that experience, I know that experience in Selma has not only influenced my entire life, but influenced whatever else I was going to do, whether I was a volunteer in the hometown where I lived for so many years, San Anselmo, California. I know that it changed how I talked to people, how I lived my life. how it affected my students. I know that there are many listening. I hope that they will tell some of their memories. It truly made me go deeper inside. I think it gave my life shape. It gave me that great sense of community because I learned from the people that I lived, with whom I lived in the inner city of St. Louis. I was able to share with them about 20 years ago, those same people. And there I realized they showed me that sense of community because they shared facilities with me. They reached out to people. They just seemed to know that nothing was more important than people. And that's what I got from my search in Selma.
Thank you. Thank you. Carol, you wrote a special column for Global Sisters Report to wrap up the Sisters of Selma Q&A series that you've done. Could you please share with us? I invite people to go back and look it up and read it, but can you share some of the common themes that you noticed in those interviews regarding the motivation to participate, how it influenced their ministries, what stayed with them? Share with us what you found, what commonalities you found.
Well, both Therese and Sister Pat have already talked about some, and I'll add some others. They talked about the singularity of their experience. Mm-hmm. You know, sometimes you're in a moment and hours, days, months, years later, you realize what a powerful moment that was. The sisters also talked about the experience as a catalyst for future activism. And as they told me their stories, their work has continued in so many ways. Civil rights, I mean, just all the social, you think of all the social hot buttons and tensions of the 1960s into the 70s. And now everything from environmentalism, climate change, immigration, you know, ethnic issues, LGBTQ. Sisters use that as a catalyst, and just, it's like they couldn't let go. They experienced that and got that feel for social justice and moved forward. A couple of things that I picked up also include the importance of nonviolent action and how that was very powerful to their experience there. And most of it saw it as a very powerful tool. And when they compared then to now, typically this idea of nonviolent strategies and actions come up. Either they don't see it as much as they want in the 2020s, or they point it out. Also, these are very educated women. And the graduate school experience they had or were getting at the time clearly played a part in their reflection and thought about this and their studies, particularly at the graduate level. The other thing was that we can read things in books and we can think about them and think, wow, well, this was more than theory. In other words, racism, they had experienced it, they had been there to witness it. And so this was not, these discussions were real. It was real in real world time, whether working with varieties of peoples at the time they were in Selma or later in this. So I think when we talk about social justice, I think experiential experience is very powerful. And then lastly, they looked at the Vatican II documents and very much blended their actions and their activism and saw that as a way to express the gospel as a religious. So those are my takes on all the wonderful stories and the 8 interviews I had.
Well, that's terrific. That's terrific. You did a wonderful job picking up on these common themes. We already dealt with this to some degree, but I'm going to turn it back one more time to Sister Patricia and Therese to share with us before we move forward. You know, one more time to looking back in that time, if you can share with us something that may have stayed with your heart and spirit. We talked about how it influenced your ministries, how, you know, it made sure that you inculcated this in your teachings, but what stayed close in your heart and spirit because of that time, because of that experience? Something else that you'd want to share with us?
You know, when we were leaving Alabama, when we were trying to gather our students to get ready to leave, Martin Luther King met with us and he told us that we had to leave during the night, not to leave, you know, daylight when everyone was around. And he told us to be sure we did not put Pittsburgh on the front of our buses as we were leaving, but to put some southern city, Atlanta or Richmond or wherever, because he said, you will never get out of Alabama if you leave with buses destined for the north. They will set fire to your buses and that will be it. So we did that. We followed his instructions. And of course, the immediate thing that stayed with us, I mean, was just the terrible things we had seen, because while we had seen it in newspapers before, we had seen it in television news, we never had seen it in person, you know. But after that began to subside, the deeper thing that stayed with me was the realization that racism is so prevalent in our society. Systemic racism is a United States reality. We hadn't dealt with it then. You know, there were obviously attempts to begin, and that was an attempt, and some progress was made, but we still haven't dealt with it, you know? And the reality of it that, okay, I could get in a bus and go back to Pittsburgh, and there were not going to be policemen on horseback chasing me in Pittsburgh. But the people in Alabama couldn't do that. And that reality, and Carol mentioned earlier that George Floyd, that's it today. You know, it is still in many people's communities that they live in and live with every day. That's a deep thing that stayed with me from it.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister Patricia. Therese, what about you? What has stayed in your heart?
Well, I keep thinking of John Lewis. He was mere 19 years old. And just as we were getting ready to cross to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, there was all this noise. And here I was face to face with this guard, he with his mask on, and I with nothing, just looking into his eyes. And then came this great noise from somewhere. It was the youth, the Southern Nonviolent young men and women there in Alabama. They were causing a problem so that the guards would have to leave us and go there. And what I'm getting at, it's John Lewis's message to us: always try to find a way to get in the way. And I, who many people remember me at one time, was very, very shy. I know that now they probably think, well, why don't we shut her up? But I will never shut up, because thank you, John. I am going to try to find a way to get in the way.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you for doing that. Carol, what about you? I mean, you had the opportunity to study this and to talk to all these women as you worked with the movie producer Joyce Hart on the original Sisters of Selma documentary in your research. What stayed with you? And maybe you can introduce Joyce with us.
Well, certainly it made me realize how little I know about filmmaking. I'm someone who's always depended on words to tell stories, to get my point across, to teach. And so I really learned about the importance of images, because oftentimes what sticks in our mind, we may not remember a quote exactly, we may not remember who said this when or the date, but an image is very powerful. And those images from Selma and many other things that we've all lived through, but those images from Selma are very powerful. And so the fact that Joyce Hart, the filmmaker, was pulling together the interviews with sisters as well as real footage that she acquired from networks and various sources, that intertwining made it very powerful to me. And the last piece is really, this is probably my own ignorance or arrogance here, the amount of research and preparation that was put into this film. In terms of, I'm used to researching as a historian, this is what I do, but in terms of creating this image, 57 minutes image, the amount of research, and that's where Joyce and I got to know each other. I had been doing some interviews with sisters. I've been doing some research on social justice, and I'm gonna ask Joyce to share at this point. She's here with us, and her thinking about the film, because she and I obviously have very, very different backgrounds. And so I think you all might like to hear from her about why she made the film.
Definitely, thank you.
Is it my turn now?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Joyce, for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. As Carol said, we came to this subject from very different points of view. Apart from the fact that she's a writer and I'm a filmmaker, I didn't grow up here. I came here, as you can probably hear in my accent, I came here at the age of 30, and it was what, 1987. And, you know, I had a career as a filmmaker in India, and I was trying to establish myself as a filmmaker here. And I'd made a couple of films, and then I was hired to do some co-producing on a series about women religious in the United States. And I said, oh my goodness, this is going to occupy me for the next 10 years. I mean, the history of women religious. I'm not a Catholic. I didn't know much about Catholicism, but I knew about the schools that we had in India, which were run by sisters. And at that time, Mother Teresa was unknown. I mean, when I was growing up. So we knew about these wonderful schools that the sisters ran in various parts of India. But I realized that there was a huge story there. And how could we do it in 6 parts? How could we complete it? Well, that project was never funded. And in the process of researching that, I had found out about the Selma story. And I said, well, if you give me some money, I'll run with that one. And I know that that is a story that's worth telling. So my co-producer and I, we started researching it, and we found Sister Antona Ebo. And being the first Black sister who went to march, she was key to the story. I'm not going to tell you the whole, details of how I got to make the film, but I'd just like to share a few things. One of the things was that the sisters, when I contacted them, were very puzzled. I remember the sisters in Rochester, New York saying, oh, why do you want to make this film? I mean, that was a long time ago. I mean, why do you want to make this film? And then I contact the Sisters of St. Joseph at Carondelet, and they're the ones that put me on to Carol. The sisters themselves, Roberta Schmidt and Rosemary Flanagan, they said, oh, well, okay, but I'm not sure how enthusiastic they were. Anyway, I was sent to Carol, and she had already contacted and interviewed Sister Barbara Moore and Sister Rosemary Flanagan. So that was my in on the CSJ. And this story repeated itself. But when I went to Selma, everybody there wanted to tell the story. And the contrast was just amazing to me. And it wasn't just the Black folk in Selma. Mayor Smitherman, of course, the quote unquote villain in the piece. He didn't want to be interviewed. And I really wanted to interview him, but he didn't want to be part of it. But as you will see in the film, there are people who really wanted to move Selma forward, and they really supported the voting rights action that was going on. And there were people in the Edmundite mission there, Father Willette, who'd been there, Reverend Reese, who'd been a pastor there. Both of them said, absolutely. And Father Willette, he had refused interviews for many years, but he said, if it's for the sisters, I will do it.
That's wonderful.
That's
great. That's a great story.
Yeah, and I really wanted to share that with you. And the other thing I wanted to share is that when I started looking for material, it was odd. The networks in the US had not yet realized the importance of Selma. The first people that got there, the news crew that got there, were Canadian. And Peter Jennings was a Canadian reporter at that time. So he and his crew came down to Selma, and I got a lot of the early footage and the in-between footage of those 2 weeks in Selma from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
That's interesting.
And
That's interesting.
yeah, I thought that was very educational for me. I learned so much, you know. Never having read it in the history books, for me, it was really great to be told the history by the people who lived it. You know, that was, I feel really privileged that I was able to do this. And I was also able to bring this footage, pull it, as Carol says, there's a lot of research involved. You pull all this footage out of the archives, and then you show it to the people who are actually in it. And to me, that was a life-changing experience. When the sisters, when the sisters saw, because the sisters in Selma weren't allowed to participate, so they never got to see what was going on. So this was the first time they saw what was going on in the footage that I pulled out of the archives. And so all of that was a huge privilege for me. And to Therese and Carol and Sister Patricia and everybody here who's listening, thank you very much. Thank you for letting me be part of it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing with us the background about making the film and for making the film, for taking that, you know, that risk and having that vision to capsulize this. It's so important. We wouldn't have that history without it. I'm going to bring us forward to today, because obviously we're dealing with so much structural racism still all these years later. And I'm going to turn to Sister Patrice and to Therese again, because I'm sorry, Sister Patricia and Therese again, and ask you, what strikes you as the similarities and the differences between the civil rights protests and the marches of that time and the drive to address the racial injustices of today? Sister Patricia, I'll have you go first.
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities. One of the things that I think is a similarity is I think that the young people get it. You know, that was true then. Carol mentioned that, or maybe it was Therese mentioned that John Lewis was only 17 years old at the time. You know, there were a lot of really young people, college age kids, who were really the leaders and involved. And I think that that is true today as well. When I look at these massive marches on the television news, very often it's a younger crowd. Part of that is, of course, their ability to march. It wouldn't be out there now. But I think that they get the diversity question and they get the race question much more readily than the people of my generation did or still do. I also think that part of what really gets in the way of advancing racial justice then and today is fear. I think it is fear. I think sometimes it's even fear that people couldn't name what the fears are, but the fear is there. The fear of change, the fear of diversity, the fear of the other, the fear of a person who's different, etc. But some of what is different today, I mean, of course, social media has made a huge difference, some in positive ways and some in negative ways, in terms of people's awareness of the issues and also people's ability to deal with them. I think that what's at the heart of it, though, in terms of racial justice movement, is very similar in both periods.
Interesting point. Thank you. Teresa, what about you? Teresa,
I would just add to that, you know, the similarities are that we were dealing with, in both times, 65 and 2020, with racial issues. And also I will say both times there was little from the hierarchical church. The differences, I think now we have much more public awareness. If you look at your bookshelves today, what do you see? You see on it Fear, the book Fear. You see a book called Rage. You see a book called White Fragility. You see the book called Caste. You know, in 65, I had different kinds of novels on my bookshelf. There's much more of a sense of we belong, we're here together, We're going to not only talk about unity, we're going to be out there desiring for it. And so many people of all colors, all genders are out there working together. It's much more of, we're not going to put it behind us. We're going to go forward with this.
Good. Well, speaking of going forward then, what advice do you have for the young activists drawn on your own experiences or Carol from the interviews and observations you've made? I think this time I'm going to turn to Carol first. If you have any thoughts that thing, again, commonalities when you ask this question. I think you did ask this question a couple of times in some of the interviews about advice.
Yeah, I've thought about this. And I think there's a lot to be learned about looking at a variety of social justice movements. And by that, I mean with students today. I've taught peace studies almost 2 decades and making correlations and connections. And I think it's very helpful for students, for young activists to study the past a bit. John Lewis has a wonderful autobiography. It came out late 90s, I think 1998, and it's called Walking with the Wind. But the subtitle is A Memoir of the Movement. So the entire book is really through his lens, through his eyes, his 19-year-old eyes in Selma, before and after that. And it really, I think, would engage young activists. Okay, all the setbacks. He would say, we argued all the time through these things. SNCC got mad at the older people in the, the Southern Christian leadership movement because they were trying to run things and students knew better. And he said, we're like a family. We are moving together, but we fight a lot. So it's always a little aggravating for me when I see media really playing up divisions. Of course, I mean, isn't that what a democracy is supposed to do? So I would ask them to, even just reading his autobiography would be very helpful. And secondly, one other thing that John Lewis wrote, and I think all of us here on this Zoom might benefit from that. It's a very different approach. That's historical. It's very focused and gives all kinds of very important strategies. But he also wrote another book called Across That Bridge. It's a very tiny little book, the kind you could put by your bedside or read at different times. It's life lessons and a vision for change. He talks about faith. He talks about hope. He talks about love. It's very poignant. It's good for meditation or contemplation. And that gives you his personal objective. So it's those two things, particularly from his eyes, and there's been excellent scholarship written about it, but patience is the hardest thing. I watched all this on TV in the 60s and lived through the 70s and beyond. And I thought, oh, well, we fixed everything, right? Nobody was going to behave that way anymore. I had family in the South and we traveled there. I was like, what universe have I moved into here? So I think for activists to gain strategies, thoughtfulness, but darn it, use their 21st century technology. The social media thing has tremendous drawbacks and it has tremendous power. So I would say, hey, learn from the past, learn what you can, reflect on it, and then use the strategies that you know best in the 21st century. That's
good. Good advice. Therese, I'm going to turn to you this time. What about you?
I have been in touch with so many young people, and I go to church in Newman Hall in Berkeley, and I meet a lot of those young people. And just this past Saturday, my good friend Barbara and I were able to talk to 2 adoptive students of ours. And, they listen to us and we listen to them. And the message that I have for them is to go out there and be yourself, strong, steady, be alive and seize this moment. Don't wait. Go out there and do it, because you are already today's leaders. If you look outside, who are the leaders today for climate change, for racial change, for immigration? All of those people are young, and it's not that us older people aren't doing it, but they're the ones. And I just tell them to go out there. And a long time ago, I was a first grade teacher. And I remember the first grade teacher that I had myself. And she said, you know, you just need to take a hand, open a mind, and touch a heart.
Good advice. Good advice. Sister Patricia.
I think that I would tell the young people today, I agree with Therese, they're the ones. I would tell them, get in touch with your history, your personal history, talk to your elders, talk to your grandparents, etc., to get that personal story. I would also tell them that I think nonviolence is the only route to go if you really want to affect social change. You have to be ready to experience violence, but you have to remain nonviolent yourself in order to be able to carry messages of hope. I think today, one of the things that is so different and is probably the thing that is most frightening to me is the growth of the right-wing extremism in our country that obviously has permeated us at every level. I mean, we've just been through a disaster time in terms of our government. We are conscious of the terrible darkness of the white supremacy movement and the neo-Nazis and all these groups. And all of that, you know, every time that I hear them on the news saying that the president or the attorney general say that it's Antifa that is stirring up the trouble, and I don't believe that. I believe that they want it to be that. And I think that we have to come to terms with all of those dark elements in our culture now that are complicating racial justice beyond imagination, because it makes it difficult to even have conversations among ordinary everyday people who you would have some hope can move beyond bigotry and can move beyond the divisions. But these dark forces that are actively operating are really the form that fear is taking today in preventing people from achieving that. So I really want to help young people to really be very conscious about being in touch with history, knowing what's going on, being politically active. I think that's imperative, and keeping their eyes open to what is going on around them.
That's good advice. You know, I think we all need to do that. Keep our eyes open. And again, I quote from, I think it was Sister Patricia, I think in your Q&A, you said you wanted to continue to be a thorn on the side of injustice. And Teresa, I think if I remember from your Q&A, you said, I don't ever want to lose the feeling of being uncomfortable with white privilege. I think I remember those two quotes from your Q&As, that those are the signature quotes that I remember. Well, I want to thank all of you for all the time. I want to turn to Therese for our closing prayer. And appropriately, Therese, you can introduce where they're from, the words you chose.
I will. My closing prayer is using the words of John Lewis. Remind me to answer the highest calling of my heart and stand up for what I believe. Remind me to walk with the wind and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be my guide. Remind me to do this in your holy name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Amen. Beautiful, beautiful prayer. Thank you. I want to thank you for you joining us, our guests, and for all of us who joined us for this wonderful, insightful conversation. I'd invite you please to watch for your information from Global Sisters Report about our next Witness and Grace program, which will be in January, on January 19th, about sisters who work against human trafficking. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Lori, who will tell you a little bit more about follow-up information you may want to have.
Wonderful. Gail, I first have to start by thanking you for opening this session from the Global Sisters Report to our NCR members as well. I've kind of been halfway between tears and goosebumps for the last hour. I'm so grateful, really grateful to be here today. On Thursday, we're going to have another session, and kind of the vision for this week was we would talk today about what has been, and we would talk on Thursday about what is now and what continues. And our presenters on Thursday, it was interesting. They very much want to approach the presentation from building on what's been. So they use the present tense of the verb continuing. Their title is Continuing the Journey. It's not too late to register for that. You'll receive an email with all of the information I'm telling you now, so don't worry about writing everything down. Secondly, as has been mentioned here a couple of times, and you've seen it in the chat room, the Global Sisters Report, and Carol has just done a beautiful job, Sisters of Selma, some interviews. And I have so enjoyed reading those interviews, especially in light of everything going on this summer. Really standing on the shoulders of giants, learning, listening is so important. And that series, I really can't personally attest to it enough. It's really wonderful. And that link will be in the email as well. And here's a piece of really exciting news. Thanks to Carol and Joyce's work, we are able to announce that the documentary that Joyce created is going to be made available to us exclusively. Watch your email. We'll have the link with the information where you can view it. It'll be a short-term time, so we'll ask you to kind of jump right in and watch if you would like to. I'd like to encourage you to consider watching it with whoever is in your household. Not just watching it to learn what happened, but learn what happened so that it inspires us to action today. And maybe watch it together with the people you love so that you can talk about it. How do we want to change how we live today based on what we learned from this film? So we don't want to be just inspired. We want to have impetus created by these sessions that we're doing. Lastly, I'd like to ask Therese if you would have that prayer ready again from John Lewis, because if you're all right, I'd like to ask you to read it again in a moment. I had this thought, I think, Sister Patricia, when you were speaking about the violence. I'd like us just, if we could, to have a moment of silence for all who have been martyrs for this cause, all who have suffered long-term grave physical repercussions because of their bravery and their conscience. So if we could have a moment of silence, and let's end with John Lewis's words instead of my announcements. So look for an email from me in a couple days. On a practical note, Joyce and, Carol and Gail, if you could stay on the line after we're done. So a moment of silence, please.
Oh, Holy One, remind me to answer the highest calling of my heart and stand up for what I believe. Remind me to walk with the wind and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be my guide. Remind me to do this in your holy name. Amen.
Amen. And all the people said,
Amen.
Amen.
Amen.